Welcome back in. Now to some sad news tonight. Hollywood actor Richard Roundtree lost his battle yesterday with pancreatic cancer. The 81-year-old was known for his iconic leading role in the hit 1971 film Shaft. Former actor and sports talk radio host Matthew Laurance knew Roundtree well.
New tonight, WKYT's photojournalist Darnell Crenshaw and our Garrett Weimer caught up with Laurance, who says Roundtree was an icon in the film industry.
A former Hollywood actor who was on Beverly Hills 90210, now Lexington sports talk radio host Matthew Laurance remembers his good friend.
When I heard the news last night, which was very unexpected, he had pancreatic cancer and it took him in a week. I mean, like that.
Laurance remembers the good times they had together on the golf course.
The hug you got from Richard was almost unlike any hug from anybody else. There was a charisma about him. He made you feel better. He made you feel like things were possible.
Film critics say Roundtree's role as John Shaft in 1971 was groundbreaking because it was the first time mainstream America was introduced to an African-American action hero.
There was nothing like this. I mean, an action hero now, and now, of course, there have been many now. Richard was the first of that genre.
In 1993, Roundtree was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Yeah, most men don't think that that's a possible thing to happen to them.
October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Melissa Carr is with Kentucky Cancer Link. She says there's a small percentage of men who are diagnosed with breast cancer.
And men, they do have breast tissue that they need to be aware if there are any changes or any lumps or bumps or swelling that's unusual that they may experience.
Roundtree was a survivor and became an advocate for breast cancer awareness among men. The world may have known him as John Shaft, but Laurance knew him as Richard.
An incredibly talented, giving actor who was an even better person.
In Lexington, Garrett Weimer, WKYT.
Roundtree made appearances in other films and TV shows, things like Chicago Fire, Grey's Anatomy, and Desperate Housewives. Laurance says he wished the two could have acted together, but he says Roundtree being a part of his life was more important.